The champagne was vintage Krug, the lilies had been flown in from the Netherlands that morning, and the guest list for my son's wedding read like a who's who of San Francisco's old money elite. Standing on the terrace of the Sterling estate, overlooking the fog rolling across the bay, I should have been the proudest father in Northern California. Sterling Sons Heritage Interiors was more than a furniture empire. It was a legacy of craftsmanship and steel-bound reputation that had survived 4 generations. My son, Julian, was the crown prince of that legacy. But as I watched him adjust his cufflinks, his face radiant with a terrifyingly blind kind of devotion, a cold knot of dread tightened in my chest. Then, my phone vibrated in my tuxedo pocket. It was an unknown number, 3 digits off from a local exchange. I stepped away from the hum of the string quartet and the clinking of crystal, seeking the shadows of the stone balustrade. "Alistair Sterling," I said, my voice low and authoritative. "Do not let him sign those papers, Alistair." The voice on the other end was a raspy whisper, filtered through what sounded like a voice modulator or a very bad connection. "If he says I do, you lose everything. Not just your son. The empire. Vivienne isn't who you think she is. Check the records for a woman named Elena Vane in Chicago. Haingin Lemur Lum. Do it before the vows." The line went dead. I stared at the screen, the reflection of the sunset turning the glass into a pool of blood. I had exactly 20 minutes before the processional began. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked through the French doors and saw Vivienne. She was draped in custom Vera Wang, a vision of ivory innocence, laughing with a group of venture capitalists. She caught my eye and blew a kiss, her smile perfect, practiced, and for the first time utterly chilling. To understand how I ended up on that terrace, paralyzed by a cryptic warning, you have to understand the 5 months of calculated warfare that led us here. It didn't start with a phone call. It started with a coffee spill and a grin that felt like sunlight. I was in the middle of reviewing the quarterly logistics reports for our Pacific Heights showroom when Julian practically floated through the mahogany doors of my office. He didn't knock. He didn't wait for his assistant. He just stood there, his hair a mess, holding a velvet box like it contained the Holy Grail. "Dad," he breathed, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that made me ache for his late mother. "I did it," I asked her. She said yes. I set my fountain pen down, the ink staining the blotter. "Julian, it's been 5 months. We haven't even finished the background vetting for the junior designers, and you've committed your life to a woman we barely know." "I know her, Dad," he snapped, the excitement in his eyes hardening into a familiar, stubborn glint. "I know her heart. She's not like the socialites you tried to set me up with. Vivienne is. She's real. She doesn't care about the Sterling name. She didn't even know who I was when we met at that little cafe in Sausalito. That was the first red flag, though I didn't want to see it then. No one in the Bay Area didn't know who a Sterling was, especially not a woman who dressed as well as Vivienne Vance did. I took a slow breath, forcing my face into a mask of paternal support. I had spent 30 years reading people across negotiation tables. I knew that pushing Julian now would only drive him further into her arms. "Then I suppose it's time for a proper dinner," I said. "Tonight, at the Fairmont." The dinner was an exercise in psychological evaluation. The Fairmont was old money, personified stiff linens, quiet service, and a wine list that could buy a mid-size sedan. It was a litmus test. I wanted to see if Vivienne would be intimidated, or if she would overcompensate. She did neither. She arrived in a dress that cost more than my first car, her poise so absolute it felt like armor. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her grip firm, her eyes a piercing, intelligent green. "Julian speaks of you as if you're a god. It's intimidating to finally meet the man behind the myth." "I'm just a carpenter who got lucky with a few investments, Vivienne," I replied, watching her carefully. "A carpenter with 8 showrooms and a private timber reserve in Oregon," she countered with a playful tilt of her head. "I think lucky is a bit of an understatement." Throughout the meal, she was a chameleon. When Julian spoke about his passion for mid-century restoration, she was the doting, supportive partner, leaning in until their shoulders touched. But when the conversation drifted toward the business, toward the legal structure of Sterling Sons, her posture sharpened. She didn't ask about money directly. She asked about governance. She asked about legacy protection. She asked about the board of directors. "I've always found it fascinating," Vivienne said, swirling a glass of vintage Cabernet, How families like yours maintain control over generations. It must be so stressful, knowing that one wrong move, one bad partnership, could liquidate a century of work. We have excellent lawyers, I said shortly. I'm sure you do, she smiled, and for a second, the mask slipped. It wasn't a smile of warmth, it was the smile of a predator admiring a well-built cage. But even the best lawyers can't protect a man from his own heart, can they? The silence that followed was heavy. Julian, oblivious, reached over and squeezed her hand. That's why I'm so glad I found you, Viv. We're going to be the new chapter of this legacy. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study, staring at the portrait of my wife, Sarah. She had been the soul of the business, the one who could spot a fake grain in a piece of oak from 20 feet away. She would have hated Vivienne. Not because she was beautiful or ambitious, but because Vivienne felt engineered. Over the next few weeks, Vivienne became a ghost in the machine of our lives. She was everywhere. She started showing up at the showrooms, helping Julian with the rebranding project. She made suggestions about our suppliers, hinting that our long-term partnership with the Miller family's sawmill was sentimental rather than economical. The tension reached a breaking point on a Sunday morning at the estate. We were having brunch on the patio when Vivienne casually mentioned a consultant she knew from her time in New York, a man named Jax Vane. He's a genius with corporate restructuring, Alistair, she said, spooning yogurt, as if she weren't suggesting we tear apart our internal hierarchy. He thinks Sterling Sons is undervalued because of its closed-loop ownership. If we opened up some equity. We are a private family firm, I interrupted, my voice like flint. We don't open up equity to outsiders. But I'm not an outsider anymore, am I? She asked softly. In a month, I'll be a Sterling. And as Julian's wife, his interests are my interests. I just want to ensure he isn't burdened by outdated models. Julian looked at me, and I saw the betrayal in his eyes. He didn't see a woman trying to take his company. He saw a father refusing to let his son grow up. Dad, maybe she has a point. You've been running things the same way since Motngin Jincham Jinmui. The world has changed. The wood hasn't changed, Julian, I said. The craft hasn't changed. But the money has, Vivienne whispered. That was the moment I knew I had to act. I couldn't just be a suspicious father. I had to be a Sterling. I waited until they left for a charity gala, then I went into Julian's home office. I felt like a criminal, a traitor to my own blood, but I began searching. I didn't find much. Vivienne was careful, but I found a receipt for a private courier service tucked inside a drawer. The destination, a law firm in Chicago, the same city the mysterious caller would later mention. The next morning, I made a call I hoped I'd never have to make. I contacted Cassidy Thorne. Cass was a former federal investigator who specialized in high-net-worth matrimonial disputes. In plain English, she was a professional at finding the rot hidden behind beautiful faces. We met in a dive bar in the Mission District, a place where nobody would recognize a man who appeared on the cover of Architectural Digest. I handed her the meager details I had. Vivienne Vance, age Haimui Chin, supposedly from a private family in Virginia. She's too perfect, Cass, I said, sliding a photo of her across the scarred wooden table. She's managed to turn my son against my business judgment in less than half a year. She's pushing for restructuring. She's pushing for equity. Cassidy looked at the photo, her eyes narrowing. I've seen this look before, Alistair. This isn't a woman in love. This is a woman on a clock. You give me 2 weeks, and I'll tell you what she's hiding. I don't have 2 weeks, I said. The wedding is in 10 days. Then I'll work double shifts. But Alistair, if she's who I think she is, you're going to wish you'd never met her. These types don't just want a settlement. They want the keys to the vault. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of forced smiles and escalating demands. Vivienne convinced Julian that they needed a modern prenuptial agreement, one that she had drafted by her own family lawyers. Julian presented it to me as a gesture of goodwill. See, Dad? She's not after your money. She's even willing to sign a waiver on the estate. I read the document. It was a masterpiece of legal deception. While it waived her right to the physical estate, it contained clauses about operational control and consulting fees that would effectively give her a seat at the head of the table if anything ever happened to me. It was a slow-motion coup d'etat. Don't sign this, Julian, I pleaded. I already did, Dad. Last night. I trust her. Why can't you? The night before the wedding, Cassidy called me. Her voice was uncharacteristically shaky. Alistair, I've found something. It's not just Vivienne. There's a whole network. I'm sending you a file, but you need to be careful. If they realize I'm digging, they'll accelerate the timeline." I waited for the email. My hand hovered over the mouse in the dark of my study. When the notification finally pinged, I opened the attachment, and my world tilted on its axis. There was a photo of Vivienne from 5 years ago. Her hair was black then, her name was listed as Elena Vane, and she was standing next to a man I recognized instantly, from her consultant recommendation, Jax Vane. But they weren't business partners. They were standing in front of a courthouse in Illinois, holding a marriage license. But it was the second photo that broke me. It was a picture of a man named Silas Montgomery, a wealthy real estate developer from Chicago. He looked exactly like my son, young, earnest, and deeply in love. The headline below the photo read, "Local tycoon Silas Montgomery found dead in apparent suicide after massive embezzlement scandal, wife missing." I looked at the date. The embezzlement had happened exactly 6 months after Silas had married Elena Vane, the woman now known as Vivienne. And then, I heard the door to my study creak open. I looked up to see Vivienne standing there in her silk robe, a glass of water in her hand. She looked at the computer screen, then she looked at me. The innocence was gone. Her eyes were as hard as emeralds, and a slow, cruel smile spread across her face. "You really should have stayed in the workshop, Alistair," she whispered. "Now, things are going to get complicated." The air in my study turned frigid the moment Vivienne stepped into the light. She didn't look like a blushing bride-to-be caught in a secret. She looked like an executioner who had just found a sharper blade. I felt the sweat prickle at the back of my neck, the glowing computer screen behind me feeling like a neon sign pointing to her crimes. But the most terrifying part wasn't the evidence I had found. It was the fact that she wasn't running. "You have a very inquisitive mind, Alistair," she said, her voice smooth, devoid of the honeyed warmth she usually reserved for Julian. She set the glass of water down on my mahogany desk, right next to the folder containing the death of Silas Montgomery. "It's a shame. You spent so much of your life looking at wood grain instead of people. You might have seen this coming." "I see it now," I growled, my hand moving toward the desk phone. "I see a predator. I see a woman who drove a man to his grave in Chicago and thinks she can do the same to my son. The police are going to find this very interesting, Elena." She didn't flinch at the use of her real name. Instead, she laughed a short, dry sound that echoed off the leather-bound books. "The police? For what, Alistair?" "Marrying a man who had a mental breakdown. Silas Montgomery was a weak man who embezzled from his own firm. I was the grieving widow. There were no charges. There was no crime. Just a series of very unfortunate events." "And Jax Vane?" I asked, gesturing to the photo of her husband/accomplice. "Is he another unfortunate event?" Vivienne leaned over the desk, her face inches from mine. The scent of her expensive perfume, something floral and cloying, filled my lungs. "Jax is my brother, Alistair, or my cousin, or my former business partner. It depends on which paperwork you're looking at. But here's what you need to understand. Julian loves me. If you show him those photos, if you tell him I'm a predator, do you know what he'll see? He'll see a father so obsessed with control that he hired a private investigator to smear the woman he loves. He'll see the man who made his mother's final years miserable with workaholism, trying to destroy his only chance at happiness. I am protecting him, I said, my voice trembling with rage. You're losing him, she countered. And if you try to stop this wedding tomorrow, I'll make sure you lose the company too. I know about the Kensington project, Alistair. I know about the creative accounting you used to keep the Oregon timber reserves from going into probate after Sarah died. One phone call to the IRS, and the Sterling legacy becomes a federal investigation. Is that what you want for Julian's inheritance? My heart stopped. The Kensington project was a legal gray area I had entered out of desperation years ago to save the family land. I had buried those records deep. How did she know? Then I remembered. Julian. He was so transparent, so trusting. He must have given her his private login for the legacy servers, thinking he was sharing his life with her. Get out, I whispered. I'm going, she said, straightening her silk robe. I have a wedding to prepare for. I suggest you get some sleep, Alistair. You want to look your best when you walk me down the aisle, because you will walk me down the aisle. For Julian's sake. She left the room, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a tomb closing. I sat in the darkness for hours, the weight of her threat pressing down on me. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my son's heart. I was fighting a war on two fronts. Vivienne had infiltrated our home, our business, and my son's mind. She was a master of the psychological siege, and I had underestimated her every step of the way. The morning of the wedding was a masterpiece of organized chaos. The Sterling estate was swarming with caterers, florists, and the heavy-set security team I'd hired, men who were supposed to keep the peace, but now felt like guards at my own prison. I found Julian in the grooming suite, sipping a scotch he was far too young to be drinking at 10 in the morning. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, looking at me through the mirror as a barber trimmed his sideburns. "You look like you haven't slept since the 90s. "Just wedding jitters, son," I lied, the words tasting like copper. I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. He felt so young, so fragile. I thought back to when he was 8, crying because he'd scratched the finish on a hand-carved rocking chair I'd built for him. I had told him then that anything can be repaired if the foundation is solid. But how do you repair a life built on a lie? "I'm really happy, Dad," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Since Mom passed, I felt like I was just waiting for the clock to run out. But Vivienne makes me feel like the clock is just starting. Thank you for being supportive. I know you were worried about the timeline, but it means everything that you're here." I squeezed his shoulder, unable to speak. The guilt was a physical weight. I knew the truth, but I also knew that if I told him now, in this state, he wouldn't just break, he would shatter. I had to be smarter. I had to play the long game. I stepped out into the hallway and saw a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with sharp vulpine features, and a suit that fit him like a second skin. He was standing near the entrance to the bridal suite, checking his watch. It was Jax Vane. He looked up and saw me, and a slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. He didn't look like a consultant. He looked like a man who was used to cleaning up messes. "Mr. Sterling," he said, stepping forward and extending a hand. "Jax Vane, it's an honor. Vivienne hasn't stopped talking about the craftsmanship of this estate." "I'm sure she hasn't," I said, ignoring his hand. "What exactly is your role here today, Mr. Vane? Besides, consulting?" "I'm here to ensure the transition goes smoothly," he said, his voice a low, gritty baritone. "Weddings are like mergers, wouldn't you agree? Lots of moving parts. Lots of opportunities for things to go wrong if they aren't managed by professionals." "Is that what happened in Chicago?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "A merger gone wrong." Jax's expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold, the kind of cold you only find in the deepest parts of the woods. "Chicago was a long time ago, Alistair. We prefer the climate in San Francisco. There's so much more growth potential here." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't be a hero, old man. You have a beautiful house, a beautiful legacy, and a son who still likes you. Keep your mouth shut, let the girl have her moment, and maybe we'll leave you enough of a pension to retire comfortably in Napa, if you make a scene." Well, I've seen what happens to people who try to interrupt Vivienne when she's focused. It's never pretty. He patted my arm, a gesture of mock affection that made my skin crawl, and walked away. I was trapped. I had the evidence, but it was useless if she could destroy the company with a single whistle blow. I had the private investigator, Sarah Miller, but she was miles away, still digging into the Chicago assets. I was alone in a house full of people who thought we were celebrating love, while I was actually watching the opening moves of a corporate massacre. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock. The music, a sweeping arrangement of Pachelbel's canon, started to play, and the guests took their seats. I stood at the back of the aisle, my arm linked with Vivienne's. Through the lace of her veil, I could see her eyes. They weren't focused on Julian, who was standing at the altar with tears in his eyes. They were focused on the house. She was measuring the ceilings, counting the heirlooms, calculating the square footage. As we began the walk down the aisle, she leaned in and whispered so softly that only I could hear, "Smile, Alistair. The photographers are watching. This is the moment you give it all away." We reached the altar. I placed her hand in Julian's. I felt like I was handing him a live grenade. The minister began the service, the familiar words about "till death do us part" ringing out like a death knell. I took my seat in the front row, my heart racing. Then, I felt my phone vibrate again. I shouldn't have looked. It was the middle of the ceremony. But something told me this was the only lifeline I had left. I shielded the screen with my program. It was a text from Sarah Miller. "Alistair, stop the wedding. I found the link. It's not just embezzlement. Silas Montgomery didn't kill himself. I have the medical examiner's unredacted report. Vivian wasn't just the wife. She was the beneficiary of a secret key man insurance policy. Silas didn't even know he had. And Alastair. Julian just signed one yesterday. I found the digital filing. Jack's Vane is the agent of record. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just after the business. They were planning to kill my son. I looked up at the altar. The minister was saying, "If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at Julian, who was looking at Vivian with more love than I had ever seen in a human being. I looked at Vivian, who was looking at Julian like he was a lamb headed for the slaughter. I looked at Jack's Vane, standing in the shadows by the exit, his hand resting inside his jacket. I realized then that if I spoke, I might die. If I spoke, the company might fall. But if I didn't speak, my son was a dead man. I took a breath to stand, my chair scraping against the stone floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned toward me. Julian looked confused. Vivian's eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. "I have something to say," I began, my voice cracking. But before I could finish, a loud crash erupted from the back of the estate. The heavy oak doors swung open, and a man I hadn't seen in years, a man who was supposed to be dead, stumbled into the room, his face pale and his clothes tattered. "She's a murderer," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the bride. It was Silas Montgomery, and as the room erupted into chaos, I realized that the nightmare was only just beginning. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about the woman my son was about to marry. The silence that followed Silas Montgomery's entrance wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the Sterling Estate's grand ballroom. For 3 heartbeats, the only thing audible was the distant, rhythmic crashing of the Pacific against the cliffs below. Silas stood at the threshold, a ghost in the flesh, his eyes wild and sunken, looking like a man who had crawled out of a shallow grave, which, as I would soon learn, wasn't far from the truth. "Silas." Vivian's voice was a jagged whisper. The poise I had spent months admiring or fearing disintegrated instantly. Her face didn't just go pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray. She looked at him not with the shock of seeing a dead friend, but with the pure, unadulterated terror of a killer seeing their victim rise. You're supposed to be in the ground," she stammered, her hand trembling so violently that the bridal bouquet of white lilies slipped from her fingers, hitting the stone floor with a dull thud. Julian looked between his bride and the haggard man in the doorway, his face a mask of total confusion. "Vivian? Who is this? What is he talking about?" But Vivian didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. Her gaze was locked on Silas, and for the first time, I saw the true Elena Vane. The sophisticated, old money socialite was gone. In her place was a cornered animal, calculating her exit even as her world collapsed. Before Silas could take another step, Jack's Vane moved. With the predatory speed of a man used to violence, he stepped from the shadows by the French doors. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a man who had a contingency plan for everything, even the resurrection of the dead. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to pull a weapon right there in front of 200 guests. "Security," Jax barked, his voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "We have an intruder. Get this man out of here." 4 of the heavy-set men I had thought were my security team men, Jax had vetted and placed, converged on Silas. They didn't grab him with the careful restraint of estate guards. They tackled him with a brutality that made the guests scream. "Wait!" I shouted, stepping forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Leave him. He has something to say." "He's a deranged stalker, Alastair," Jax shouted back, his face turning a deep, angry crimson. "He's been harassing Vivian for years. Get him out." They dragged Silas toward the side exit. As he struggled, his voice cracked again, desperate and raw. "Check the policy, Alastair. Check the date she took it out on Julian. She's not waiting for the divorce. She's waiting for the funeral." The heavy oak doors slammed shut, muffling his cries. The room exploded into a cacophony of whispers and panicked movement. Julian stood at the altar, frozen, his hands still outstretched toward where Vivian had been standing. But Vivian was already moving. She grabbed Julian's arm, her fingers digging into his skin so hard I could see the marks forming. "Julian, please," she sobbed, the tears appearing with a mechanical precision that turned my stomach. "He's a man from my past, a stalker from Chicago. He's obsessed. He's tried to kill me before. We have to leave. We have to go somewhere safe." "Is that true, Viv?" Julian asked, his voice sounding small, like a child lost in a storm. Is he the one you told me about?" Yes, he's the reason I moved here. He's the reason I changed my name. I was so scared he'd find me." She buried her head in his chest, her shoulders heaving with practiced grief. I stood there, looking at my son, my brilliant, naive son, as he wrapped his arms around the woman who was planning to bury him. I felt a surge of cold, hard clarity. The stalker narrative was her escape hatch. If she could convince Julian that Silas was the villain, she could salvage the play. She just needed to get him alone. "The wedding is over," I announced, my voice booming through the hall. I didn't care about the socialites. I didn't care about the who's who of San Francisco. Everyone out. Now. I didn't wait for the guests to leave. I turned and headed straight for my study, my mind racing. I didn't know it yet, but the next hour would be the most dangerous 60 minutes of my life. Inside the study, I locked the door and threw myself at the computer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I needed to see that insurance policy. I needed to know if Sarah Miller's information was correct. If Vivienne had taken out a key man policy on Julian, it meant she had already bypassed the board. She had used Julian's own signature to authorize a document that would pay her out $50 million upon his death. I accessed the secure cloud server for Sterling Sons. My eyes scanned the recent filings, and there it was, filed 4 days ago. A life insurance policy through a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary wasn't the company. It wasn't the Sterling Trust. It was Vivienne Vance Sterling. But there was something else. A second document attached to the filing. A medical authorization. It gave Vivienne the right to make all medical decisions for Julian in the event of incapacitation. I felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't just planning an accident. She was planning to be the one who pulled the plug. A soft knock sounded at the door. Not the frantic banging of a panicked son, but a slow, rhythmic tapping. "Alistair," a voice said. It was Jack's. "Open the door. We need to talk about the Kensington project before the authorities arrive." I froze. He was still playing that card. He thought he could blackmail me into silence while they finished the job. I looked around the room, searching for anything, a weapon, a way out. My eyes landed on the heavy, hand-carved letter opener on my desk, a gift from my father. It was made of tempered steel, sharp enough to draw blood with a touch. I slid it into the waistband of my trousers, hidden by my tuxedo jacket. "The Kensington project won't save you, Jax," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I've already sent the files to the feds myself. If I'm going down, I'm taking both of you with me." It was a bluff, a massive, desperate lie. But it worked. The silence on the other side of the door stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. "You're lying," Jax finally said, but the confidence was gone from his voice. "You love this company too much to torch it." "I love my son more," I replied. I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my phone and dialed Cassidy Thorne. "Cass, where is Silas? My security took him." "I'm ahead of you, Alistair," she said, her voice crackling with static. "I had a team following the wedding. My guys intercepted the van 2 miles from the estate. We have Silas. He's safe, but he's in bad shape. He's been held in a private rehab facility in Nevada for the last 2 years. Jack's vein was paying the bills to keep him drugged and hidden. Did he tell you how he escaped?" "He didn't escape. Someone let him out. Someone who wanted this to blow up today." The realization hit me like a physical blow. There was another player on the board. Someone who knew Vivienne's past and wanted to destroy her just as much as I did. But who? "Listen to me," I said. "Vivienne is trying to get Julian away from the estate. She's going to use the stalker story to get him to a safe house. If she gets him alone, he's dead. Where are you?" "Vance prevented. We're 10 minutes out. Stay with Julian. Do not let him out of your sight." I hung up and ran for the bridal suite. I burst through the doors, expecting to find Julian and Vivienne. Instead, the room was empty. The window was open, the white lace curtains billowing in the sea breeze. Vivienne's veil lay shredded on the floor, like the skin of a snake that had just molted. They were gone. I ran to the balcony. Below, in the driveway, I saw my black Mercedes SUV pulling away, tires screeching against the gravel. Julian was in the passenger seat. Vivienne was driving. Behind them, a second car, a gray sedan I recognized as Jax's, followed close behind. "No," I whispered. I didn't think. I didn't call the police. I knew that by the time they arrived, Vivienne would have accidentally driven the car off the Pacific Coast Highway, or Julian would have had a sudden heart attack from the stress of the day. I ran for the garage, jumping into my own vintage Mutngin Jinchum Samui by Mustang, the car I'd spent 10 years restoring with Julian. As I roared out of the driveway, the engine screaming, I realized the trap hadn't just been set for Julian. It had been set for all of us. Vivienne hadn't just come for the money. This was personal. What I didn't know yet was the secret Silas had whispered to Cassidy before he passed out in the van. A secret that traced back 30 years to a small carpentry shop in Seattle and a man named Sterling who had made a very different kind of mistake. The chase was on. The fog was rolling in thick now, swallowing the headlights, turning the winding coastal road into a gray abyss. I pushed the Mustang to its limit, the ghost of my wife's voice screaming in my head to save him. I saw the taillights of the SUV about half a mile ahead, weaving dangerously near the cliffside. I was gaining on them. But then, the gray sedan Jax's car slowed down, blocking both lanes of the narrow road. He was the rear guard. He was the one who was going to make sure I never reached my son. Jax rolled down his window and gestured for me to pull over. When I didn't, he began to ram the side of my Mustang, the screech of metal on metal echoing over the roar of the ocean. "Get off the road, Alistair," he screamed over the wind. "It's over. Let her finish it." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I looked at the cliff edge, only inches away. I looked at the man trying to kill me. And then, I remembered something my father had told me about working with old, stubborn oak. If you can't bend it, you have to break it. I didn't brake. I accelerated. I slammed my car into the rear of Jax's sedan, sending us both spinning toward the abyss. At the last possible second, I saw a flash of blue and red lights in the distance. The police? Or someone else? As my car careened toward the guardrail, I had one final thought. I never told Julian why I really hated those lilies. What happened next changed the fate of the Sterling legacy forever. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the shriek of twisting metal and the smell of burning rubber. My Mustang, a beast of American steel I'd spent a decade perfecting, slammed into Jax's sedan with the force of 30 years of repressed rage. I felt the impact in my teeth, a bone-jarring vibration that sent my vision swimming in a sea of red and gray. For a second, we were locked together, two predators tumbling toward the white foam of the Pacific. Then, the guardrail gave way with a sound like a gunshot, and Jax's car spun off into the darkness. I didn't watch him go. I couldn't. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screaming as they fought for purchase on the rain-slicked asphalt. The Mustang came to a halt inches from the edge, the front wheels dangling over a 100-foot drop. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, and my hands were locked onto the steering wheel so tight I thought the leather would snap. I didn't breathe until I saw the taillights of the SUV again. Vivienne wasn't stopping. She had seen the crash, seen her brother go over the side, and she hadn't even tapped the brakes. She was a shark that only knew how to swim forward, and right now, she was swimming toward the final kill. I threw the Mustang into reverse, the engine coughing but holding together. I had to get to Julian. I had to reach him before they reached the point, a jagged peninsula 5 miles up the coast where the road ended at a private, abandoned lighthouse owned by the Sterling Trust. It was a place Julian loved, a place of childhood memories. Vivienne had chosen it because she knew he would feel safe there. She was using his own nostalgia as a blindfold. I didn't know it yet, but the real nightmare wasn't just the woman in the car ahead of me. It was the history I had tried to bury 30 years ago in a small, sawdust-filled shop in Seattle, a secret that was about to be dragged into the light by the very person I was trying to save. I reached the lighthouse 10 minutes later. The SUV was parked near the cliff's edge, its engine still ticking as it cooled. The lighthouse tower loomed over the scene like a skeletal finger pointing at a bruised sky. The fog had moved in thick now, a wet, heavy blanket that muffled the sound of the waves. I climbed out of the car, the letter opener still tucked into my waistband, its cold weight a reminder of the violence I was prepared to do. I saw them standing near the railing of the observation deck. Julian was backed against the rusted iron, his face illuminated by the rhythmic, ghostly sweep of the automated beacon. Vivienne stood in front of him, but she wasn't holding him anymore. She was holding a heavy, black object, a handgun. "Stay back, Alistair!" she screamed, her voice carried away by the wind. The innocent bride was gone. Her hair was matted by the salt spray, and her eyes were wide with a manic, flickering light. "I mean it. One more step, and Julian goes over." "Dad!" Julian's voice was a ragged sob. He looked at the gun, then at the woman he had sworn to cherish only hours ago. She told me Jax was dead. She said you killed him. She said you've been planning to take the whole company and leave me with nothing." "She's lying, Julian," I shouted, moving slowly, my hands raised. "Look at the insurance policy. Look at what happened to Silas. He's alive, Julian. He's with the police right now." Vivienne laughed a jagged, ugly sound. "The police? You think I'm afraid of the police? By the time they get through this fog, the narrative will be written. A tragic murder-suicide. The grieving father, driven mad by the loss of his business, kills the newlyweds and then himself. It's poetic, really. The sterling legacy ending exactly where it started, in blood and wood." "What are you talking about?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. Vivienne turned her gaze to me, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "He doesn't know, does he, Alistair? He doesn't know about the Kensington Project, isn't a tax shelter. He doesn't know that Kensington was the name of the man you cheated out of his patents in Seattle. The man who lost his shop, his home, and eventually his life, because you wanted to be a king of interiors." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. This was the rot. This was why she had targeted us. It wasn't just greed. It was a debt being collected. "My father was a better craftsman than you'll ever be," Vivienne spat, her voice dripping with venom. "But he didn't have your lawyers. He didn't have your ruthlessness. He died in a rented room with sawdust in his lungs and your name on his lips. I didn't find Julian by accident. I tracked every penny you made, every showroom you opened, waiting for the perfect moment to take it all back, with interest." Julian looked at me, the confusion in his eyes turning into a horrific realization. "Dad, is she telling the truth? Who was Kensington?" I couldn't look at him. The shame I'd carried for 3 decades, the secret I'd buried under layers of mahogany and success, was laid bare. "I was young, Julian. We were partners. I made a choice to protect our future. I didn't think—" "You didn't think he had a daughter," Vivienne interrupted, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You didn't think she'd grow up to be your son's greatest weakness." She turned the gun back to Julian. "I never loved you, Julian, not for a second. Every kiss, every I love you, every plan for our future was a performance. You were just the key to the vault. And now, I don't need the key anymore. I have the power of attorney. I have the insurance. All I need is for you to be a martyr." The humiliation in Julian's eyes was more painful than any bullet. He looked at the woman he'd worshipped, seeing the monster behind the mask, and his spirit seemed to wither right in front of me. She hadn't just stolen his future. She had reached back and poisoned his past. "Why?" Julian whispered. "Why not just take the money? Why kill me?" "Because Alistair needs to feel what my father felt," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "Total, absolute loss. I want him to watch the light go out of his legacy." "Vivienne, stop," I pleaded, stepping forward. "Take the company. I'll sign everything over. Every showroom, every acre of timber. Just let him go." "It's too late for deals, Alistair. The policy pays out on death, not on a transfer of assets. And besides, I've grown quite fond of the idea of being the tragic widow Sterling. The press will adore me." She raised the gun, aiming it at Julian's chest. I lunged forward, but the distance was too great. I felt like I was moving through molasses, the world slowing down to the beat of my own failing heart. But then, a shape emerged from the fog behind her. It was Jax. He was dripping wet, his tuxedo shredded, his face a mask of blood and seaweed. He hadn't gone over the cliff. He'd hit a ledge and crawled back up, fueled by a betrayal of his own. Because in the car, right before we hit, I'd screamed something at him, something Vivienne hadn't told him. I'd told him that the insurance policy didn't name him as a secondary beneficiary. It named no one but her. Jax didn't say a word. He grabbed Vivienne's arm, wrenching it upward just as the gun discharged. The shot echoed like thunder, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding me. "You bitch!" Jax roared, the two of them spiraling into a violent struggle. "You were going to leave me with nothing? You told me we were partners. You were a tool, Jax, she screamed back, clawing at his eyes. A blunt instrument. They tumbled toward the edge of the observation deck, the rusted railing groaning under their combined weight. Julian scrambled toward me, and I pulled him into my arms, shielding him with my own body. We watched in horror as the two predators tore at each other, their greed finally turning inward. "Give it to me," Jax screamed, reaching for the gun that had fallen between them. The railing gave way with a sickening screech. For a heartbeat, they were suspended in the air, a tangle of ivory silk and black wool, silhouetted against the sweeping light of the lighthouse. Then, they were gone. No scream followed. Just the distant, indifferent crash of the waves against the rocks. I held Julian as he shook, his tears soaking into my jacket. We stood there for a long time, the fog swirling around us, the silence of the lighthouse feeling like a heavy shroud. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. "It's over," I said, though I knew the lie as soon as I spoke it. I looked down at the letter opener in my hand. I had been ready to kill to protect a legacy built on a theft. I looked at my son, whose heart had been shattered by a ghost from my own past. We were alive, but the Sterling name was poisoned. I didn't know it yet, but as the police sirens finally began to wail in the distance, I realized that the real twist wasn't the death of Vivian Vance. It was what Cassidy Thorne had found in the final pages of the Chicago report, a detail about Silas Montgomery's resurrection that changed everything. Silas hadn't escaped on his own, and he hadn't been let out by a stranger. I looked at Julian, who was staring out at the ocean with eyes that looked suddenly, terrifyingly old. "Dad," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You never did tell me why you really hated those lilies." "They were her favorite," I whispered. "Your mother's." "No," Julian said, turning to look at me. "They were Elena's favorite. My mother's name wasn't Sarah, was it, Dad? Her name was Catherine Kensington. And you didn't just steal a patent, you stole a woman." The world tilted again, and this time, there was no guardrail to catch us. The blue and red lights of the San Francisco PD cruisers cut through the fog like strobes in a nightmare. The sirens were elate, mocking chorus to the violence that had just unfolded. I stood on the edge of the lighthouse observation deck, my arm around Julian's shaking shoulders, watching the forensics team descend the cliff with rappelling gear. They were looking for the broken remains of Vivienne and Jax, two ghosts who had tried to haunt us into our graves. But the real ghost was standing right next to me. Julian's words, her name was Catherine Kensington, hung in the salt-heavy air, more suffocating than the fog. I felt the ground beneath my feet, the very foundation of the Sterling legacy, beginning to erode. I had spent 30 years building a fortress of lies, convinced that if I just layered enough mahogany and success over the rot, it would disappear. "Julianne," I started, my voice sounding like dry leaves on pavement. "We need to get you to a hospital. You're in shock. You don't know what you're saying." He pulled away from me. His tuxedo was ruined, stained with salt and his own father's sweat, but his eyes were suddenly, terrifyingly clear. He didn't look like the boy who had cried over a scratched rocking chair. He looked like the man who had just watched his entire reality go over a cliff. "I'm not in shock. Alistair," he said, using my first name for the first time in his life. The weight of that single word was a physical blow. "I've known for months. I didn't meet Vivienne by accident in Sausalito. I let her find me. I wanted to see if she was as cold as the stories my mother left behind." The world tilted again. I reached for the rusted railing, my fingers brushing the jagged edge where it had snapped. "Your mother, Sarah, she died of cancer, Julian. She loved you." "Her name was Catherine," Julian whispered, his voice vibrating with a decade of buried fury. "She was the sister of the man you ruined. She married you to try and save what was left of the Kensington patents, to keep the family name alive within the company. But you didn't just take the business, did you? You took her spirit. She didn't die of cancer. She died of you." I stood paralyzed as the police officers swarmed the deck. A detective with a weary face and a heavy coat approached us, but Julian ignored him, his gaze locked on mine. "I thought I was the one protecting you, Julian," I said, the truth finally leaking out like oil. "I thought if I kept the past buried, you could grow up in the light. Everything I did, the Kensington project, the restructuring it was, to ensure you never had to feel the hunger I felt when I was a kid." "The hunger?" Julian laughed, a jagged sound that made the detective pause. "You were so hungry you ate an entire family, Dad. And Vivienne? She wasn't just some gold-digging predator. She was my cousin. We were supposed to take you down together. I felt my heart skip a beat. The air in my lungs turned to lead. Together? But she got greedy, Julian continued, looking out at the black abyss of the Pacific. She wanted the insurance money. She wanted the quick kill. I just wanted the truth. I didn't know she had hired Jax to finish it. That wasn't the plan. Julian Sterling, the detective asked, stepping between us. We need you to come with us to the station. We have a lot of questions about the deceased and the insurance policy we found in the vehicle. Julian didn't fight them. He walked toward the police car with a haunting poise, leaving me alone in the shadow of the lighthouse. I watched the tail lights disappear into the fog, realizing that my son hadn't been the victim of the play. He had been the director until the lead actress went off script. The next 48 hours were a blur of legal chess and psychological warfare. I spent them locked in my study, not mourning the woman who had tried to kill me, but trying to understand the son I had never truly known. Cassidy Thorne arrived at the estate on the second night, her face pale, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "It's worse than we thought, Alistair," she said, sitting across from me. She didn't offer her usual professional sympathy. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. I followed the paper trail Julian left. He wasn't just aware of Vivienne. He's been funneling money out of the Sterling Trust for over a year into a private account in the name of Kensington Heritage. He was rebuilding his mother's family business, I realized, the weight of the betrayal settling in my gut, using my own money to fund my replacement. He was, Cass said, but Vivienne and Jax were his insurance. If you didn't step down, they were the blunt instruments he could use to force your hand. But Vivienne was playing a double cross. She intended to eliminate both of you and take the whole pot. Julian was supposed to be the grieving survivor who inherited the empire, then handed it over to her. And Silas Montgomery, I asked, where does he fit in? Silas was the mistake, Cass replied. He was Vivienne's first real run. Julian found him in that rehab facility. He was the one who paid for Silas's release. He wanted Silas to show up at the wedding to expose Vivienne to you, Alistair. He wanted to break your heart before he took your company. He wanted you to watch your world crumble so he could step in as the savior. I leaned back, the leather chair creaking. My own son had engineered the most elaborate, cruel revenge I had ever encountered. He had invited a wolf into the house just to watch me fight it. Where is he now? He's at the penthouse in Nob Hill. The police released him. He's the victim of an attempted murder by his wife and her accomplice. The public is already painting him as the tragic hero of the Sterling family. I stood up, the letter opener still on my desk, a relic of a violence that felt almost quaint compared to this. I need to see him. Alistair, be careful, Cassidy warned. He's not the boy you raised. He's the man you made. I drove to the Nob Hill penthouse in the pouring rain. The city looked different now, sharper, colder, like a blueprint for a war I had already lost. I let myself in with my master key. The apartment was silent, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock I'd given Julian for his 21st birthday. He was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge. He didn't turn around when I entered. You always said that the quality of the finish depends on the quality of the wood, Dad, Julian said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. You spent 30 years polishing me. You shouldn't be surprised that I turned out as hard as you. I came to tell you that I'm stepping down, I said, my voice steady. The board is meeting tomorrow. I'm naming you CEO of Sterling Sons. I'm transferring all my shares to you, effective immediately. Julian finally turned. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of the boy I loved, but it was swallowed by a cold, calculating ambition that I recognized all too well. It was my own reflection. Why, he asked, is this another play? A way to keep me close so you can find a way to undermine me? No, I said. It's a gift, and a curse. You wanted the empire, Julian. It's yours, but you'll find that the crown is made of the same thorns you used on me. You'll spend every night wondering if the people you love are looking at you, or the balance sheet. You'll wonder if the woman you eventually marry is a Vivienne or a Catherine. I walked toward the door, but I stopped at the threshold. There's one thing you didn't find in your research, Julian. One thing your mother never told you. He stood up, his interest piqued despite himself. What? Catherine didn't marry me to save the patents, I said, turning to look him in the eye. She married me because she was already pregnant, and it wasn't my child, Julian. You're a Kensington through and through. I raised you because I loved her, and I loved the idea of a legacy that transcended blood. I lied to protect you from the truth that your biological father was the man who sold out your family's secrets before I ever stepped foot in that shop." Julian's face went completely still. The triumph in his eyes flickered, then died, replaced by a void of uncertainty. "You're lying," he whispered. "You're just trying to take away my claim to the name." "Check the medical records in the safe at the estate," I said. "The blood type on your birth certificate doesn't match mine. I kept it as a reminder of what love costs." I walked out, leaving him in the silence of his glass tower. I had given him everything he wanted, but I had poisoned the victory. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. I had lost my company, my son, and my reputation. But I didn't know it yet. The final reversal was already in motion. Down in the lobby, my phone vibrated. It was a message from an encrypted server. The insurance policy wasn't the only thing Jax Vane was working on. He had a backup drive. It contains the footage from the lighthouse. Not just the struggle, Alistair. It contains the conversation between you and Vivienne before he arrived. It's being uploaded to the server now. If it goes public, Julian isn't the tragic hero. He's an accessory to conspiracy. I looked up at the penthouse levels, the lights glowing like distant stars. I had a choice. I could let the son who betrayed me fall, or I could protect the ghost of the man I thought he was. The elevator doors opened, and I saw a man standing in the lobby, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat. He looked familiar, too familiar. "Hello, Alistair," the man said. "It's been a long time since Seattle." My blood turned to ice. It was Kensington, the man I had ruined, the man who was supposed to have died 30 years ago. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," he said, stepping into the light. "And I'm not just talking about the patents." The man standing in the lobby of the Nob Hill penthouse didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a masterpiece of survival, carved out of bitter wood and hardened by 30 years of salt and spite. Arthur Kensington, the man whose name I had whispered in my nightmares for 3 decades. The man who was supposed to have perished in a boarding house fire in Mutngin Jin Cham Jin Mui Sao, leaving me with a handful of patents and a heart full of guilt. He took off his hat, revealing a shock of hair as white as the Pacific foam, and eyes that held the same terrifying clarity as Julian's. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like the architect of the very room we were standing in. "You look like you've seen a poltergeist, Alistair," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down my spine. "Or perhaps just a creditor who's finally come to collect the interest on a 30-year loan." I couldn't breathe. The marble lobby, with its gold leaf accents and silent security guards, felt like it was shrinking, crushing the air out of my lungs. "Arthur, how? The fire, the dental records." "A convenient tragedy," Arthur said, stepping closer. The scent of cedar and old tobacco clung to him, the smell of the Seattle shop where we had both started. "It's amazing what a few $1,000s and a desperate coroner can accomplish when you need to disappear. You were so eager to believe I was dead, Alistair. It made the theft of my patents so much easier to live with, didn't it? You could tell yourself you were just honoring my memory by building an empire on my designs." "I did what I had to do to save the shop," I hissed, looking around to see if the concierge was listening. But the lobby was unnervingly empty, as if it had been cleared just for this confrontation. "You were drowning in debt, Arthur. You were going to lose everything to the banks. I took the patents to keep the craft alive." "And you took my daughter," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low hum. "You took Catherine. You convinced her that I was a failure who had abandoned her. Then you saved her with your sterling name and your sterling money. You didn't just steal my wood, Alistair. You stole my bloodline." I backed away, my mind racing. The Kensington project, the secret accounting, the hidden reserves. It hadn't been a defense against the IRS. It had been a beacon. Every time I moved money into those accounts, I was feeding a monster I didn't know was still hungry. "Julian," I whispered. "Does he know?" As if on cue, the elevator pinged. The doors slid open, and Julian stepped out. He didn't look shocked to see the man in the lobby. He walked over to Arthur and stood by his side, his posture identical to the old man's. The lineage was unmistakable now. They were 2 wolves in the same pack, and I was the sheep they had finally driven into the corner. "Grandfather," Julian said, his voice devoid of the warmth he'd once had for me, He's signed the papers. The transfer is complete. Arthur smiled, a thin, cruel line. Well done, boy, a Kensington back at the helm. It only took 30 years to fix your mistake, Alistair. I felt the last of my strength leave me. I sank into one of the velvet lobby chairs, the weight of the betrayal finally breaking my spine. I had raised Julian. I had taught him how to handle a chisel, how to read a balance sheet, how to be a man of honor. And all that time, he had been a Trojan horse, waiting for the signal from a man I thought was Ash. You've been in contact with him the whole time? I asked, looking at Julian. Since I was 16, Julian replied, looking down at me with something that might have been pity if it wasn't so cold. Mother told me the truth before she died. She gave me a letter for Arthur, to be delivered if I ever felt I was ready. I found him in Vancouver. He's been teaching me the business you were too afraid to show me, the real business. Not just making chairs, but making moves. Vivienne was his idea, wasn't she? I asked, looking at Arthur. Vivienne was a necessary catalyst, Arthur said, leaning on a silver-headed cane I hadn't noticed before. She was the pressure required to make you desperate enough to finalize the Kensington project. We needed you to consolidate all the assets into one reachable bucket. She was supposed to marry into the family, create a legal bridge, and then Julian would discover her fraud, cast her out, and emerge as the sole controller of the newly consolidated Sterling-Kensington merger. Jax and the insurance policy, that was her own greed, a rogue element, but in the end, it served us well. It made the collapse of your reputation absolute. You let her try to kill him. I screamed, lunging toward Arthur, but Julian stepped in front of me, his hand firm on my chest. I had it under control, Alistair, Julian said. I knew Jax was in the car. I knew the police were coming. I was never in danger, not from her. I looked at my son, no, at Arthur's grandson, and realized I was looking at a stranger, the man who had cried at the lighthouse, who had looked so broken, had been performing for me. He had needed me to feel the total loss Arthur had promised. He had needed me to witness the death of my own soul. Get out, Julian said, his voice echoing in the marble hall. The penthouse is in my name now. The estate is being listed for sale tomorrow. Your accounts are frozen, pending an internal audit of the Kensington project's creative accounting. You have nothing, Alistair, not even a name. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I walked out of the lobby and into the freezing San Francisco rain. I didn't have a car, the Mustang was a crime scene, and the SUV was at the bottom of a cliff. I walked until my tuxedo was soaked through, until my shoes were ruined, until the lights of the city blurred into a smear of mocking color. I hit rock bottom in a dive bar near the piers, a place where no one knew what a Sterling was. I sat in a booth that smelled of stale beer and regret, staring at my reflection in a cracked mirror. I was 60 years old. I had no family, no fortune, and a legacy that was being dismantled by the very people I had built it for. I pulled the letter opener from my pocket, the only thing I had left of my father's house. I looked at the steel, thinking about Vivienne's words, the light going out of the legacy. But as I sat there, a low-frequency hum started in the back of my mind. It was the sound of a wood shop. The sound of a man who knows that even the most rotted piece of timber has a core that can still be used if you shave away enough of the decay. Arthur and Julian thought they had won because they had the paperwork. They had the buildings and the bank accounts. But they didn't understand the one thing I had kept hidden, even from myself. The Kensington project wasn't just a tax shelter or a consolidation of assets. It was a digital labyrinth I had designed with Sarah Julian's mother years ago. She had known about Arthur. She had known he was alive, and that he might one day come for us. The creative accounting wasn't a crime, it was a trap. I pulled out my phone. It was nearly dead, the screen cracked. I opened a private, encrypted app that only I had the biometric key for. What happened next changed the tone of my despair into something sharper, something lethal. I looked at the lines of code, the kill switch, that Sarah and I had built into the very foundation of the company's infrastructure. If the ownership of Sterling, Sons ever transferred to someone other than a direct, biological descendant of Alistair Sterling, the poison pill would activate. Julian had told me he wasn't my son. He had claimed Kensington blood, and by doing so, he had triggered the countdown without even knowing it. Arthur thought he was taking over an empire, but in exactly 6 hours, the proprietary designs, the supply chain contracts, and the digital blueprints for every piece of furniture we had ever made would be wiped clean. The The Kensington patents he was so obsessed with would be encrypted behind a wall that would take a decade to crack. The company wouldn't just be hollow, it would be a ghost. I took a long sip of a cheap burning whiskey and felt a cold smile touch my lips. They wanted a war of legacies? Fine. But they forgot that a Sterling doesn't just build furniture. We build the room. And I was about to burn the house down with both of them inside. I didn't know it yet, but my first move wouldn't be against the company. It would be toward the one person who still owed me a debt of blood. I stood up, the rain still dripping from my hair, and walked toward the payphone in the back of the bar. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 20 years. "Cassidy," I said when she picked up, "I need you to find Mark Miller, the man who runs the sawmill in Oregon. Tell him the winter harvest is starting early. And Cassidy, tell him I'm coming to collect my wood." The revenge wasn't going to be a legal battle. It was going to be a masterpiece of craftsmanship. I was going to rebuild my life from the sawdust up, and I was going to make sure that when Arthur Kensington finally sat on his throne, it would crumble beneath him. What I didn't expect was the message that flashed on my phone just before the battery died. A photo from the lighthouse, not of the fall. It was a photo of Vivienne. She wasn't at the bottom of the cliff. She was standing in the shadows of the parking lot, her ivory dress stained red, holding a black bag. She was alive. And she had the backup drive. The game wasn't a two-way street anymore. It was a three-way collision, and I was the only one who knew where the brakes were. I didn't stay in that dive bar for long. The air was too thick with the scent of other people's failures, and I had my own to attend to. I walked 3 miles in the freezing rain until I reached a secure garage in the Mission District, a place I'd kept off the company books for 20 years. Inside sat a nondescript silver sedan and a locker filled with the things a man keeps when he knows the world might one day turn its back on him: cash, a clean passport, and the encrypted tablet that served as the detonator for the Sterling legacy. By the time I crossed the state line into Oregon, the sun was beginning to bleed over the Cascades, casting long, jagged shadows across the highway. I drove straight to the Miller sawmill. Mark Miller was a man of the earth, a giant with hands scarred by 40 years of feeding Douglas fir into high-speed saws. He was the only man left who remembered my father, and more importantly, he was the only one who knew the truth about where the Sterling old money really came from. It wasn't just patents, it was a pact. "You look like hell, Alistair," Mark said, meeting me at the edge of the log pond. The mist from the water hung in his beard like frost. "I've been through hell, Mark, and I'm bringing the fire with me." I held up the tablet. "The winter harvest protocol is active. In 4 hours, the Sterling servers will look like they've been hit by a localized EMP. Arthur and Julian are currently sitting in my office in San Francisco, probably popping vintage champagne. They think they've inherited an empire. I'm here to make sure they've inherited a graveyard." Mark looked at the tablet, then back at me. "And the boy. Julian, he's still your son, Alistair. Blood or no blood, you're the one who taught him how to walk." "The boy I raised died at the lighthouse," I said, though the words felt like they were being carved out of my chest with a dull knife. "The man who's left is a Kensington, and I'm going to show him exactly what happens to Kensingtons who try to cut down a Sterling." We moved into Mark's office, a small shack that smelled of pine pitch and old coffee. I hooked the tablet into the sawmill's satellite uplink. On the screen, a series of red bars began to tick downward. These weren't just files. They were the digital DNA of every proprietary joint, every secret varnish formula, and every client list we'd cultivated since the Motngin Chincham Tamuis. But as the countdown hit the 3-hour mark, my phone, the one I'd charged in the car, vibrated. It wasn't a call. It was a video file from an encrypted burner. I hit play. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, but the location was unmistakable: the parking lot of the Sterling estate, 30 minutes after the crash. Vivienne was there, just as I'd seen in the photo. She was leaning against a black SUV, her white bridal gown torn and muddy, looking like a ghost that had refused to cross over. But she wasn't alone. A man walked into the frame. He was tall, wearing a tailored coat, his back to the camera. He handed Vivienne a heavy envelope cash, presumably, and she handed him the backup drive from the lighthouse. Then the man turned around. It wasn't Arthur Kensington, and it wasn't Julian. It was Silas Montgomery, the victim, the man who had supposedly been drugged and hidden in a rehab facility for 2 years. He didn't look like a man who had been through a trauma. He looked like a man who had just completed a very successful business transaction. He leaned in and kissed Vivienne, not the kiss of a stalker, but the kiss of a partner. "God help me," I whispered. The realization hit me with the force of a landslide. Arthur and Julian weren't the masterminds. They were the distractions. Silas and Vivienne had been working together from the very beginning. They hadn't just targeted us for the money. They had used the decades-old rivalry between Sterling and Kensington to create a smokescreen. They knew that if they dangled the Kensington bone in front of Julian and Arthur, they'd tear the company apart from the inside. While the three of us were busy fighting a 30-year-old war, Silas and Vivienne were moving to strip the assets. The backup drive didn't just have the lighthouse footage. It had the biometric bypass codes for the Sterling Kensington Consolidated Reserves, the one bucket Arthur had insisted I create. The poison pill I was about to trigger wouldn't stop them. It would only help them. If I wiped the servers, the audit trails would disappear. They'd walk away with $200 million in liquidated assets, and the disappeared data would make it look like I was the one who had embezzled the money before burning the house down. "Mark, stop the upload," I shouted, lunging for the tablet. "What? Alistair, what's wrong?" "It's a frame. It's a complete frame." I scrambled to abort the protocol, my fingers flying over the screen. They wanted me to trigger the kill switch. It's the final piece of their puzzle. If those servers go dark now, I'm the only one the feds will come for. Julian and Arthur will be the victimized heirs, and I'll be the disgraced tycoon who committed corporate suicide. I managed to pause the countdown with 42 seconds to spare. I sat back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at the image of Silas on the screen. He was the one who had called me on the wedding day. He was the mysterious voice who had warned me about Vivienne, knowing exactly how I'd react. He had played me like a Stradivarius. "I need to get back to San Francisco," I said, standing up. "I need to get to Julian." "Alistair, he hates you," Mark reminded me. "He thinks you're the villain of his mother's story." "Then I'll have to give him a new story," I said. "A true one." I didn't take the car. Mark had a private Cessna he used for scouting timber tracks. 2 hours later, I was landing at a small airstrip in Hayward, the bay fog greeting me like an old enemy. I didn't go to the estate, and I didn't go to the Nob Hill penthouse. I went to the one place where I knew Silas would be, the Kensington Mill. It was an abandoned relic on the edge of the city, the very place where Arthur's father had started. It was poetic, and predators like Silas always loved a bit of poetry. I arrived as the rain turned into a torrential downpour. I slipped through a side door, the smell of rot and damp sawdust thick in the air. I could hear voices echoing from the upper loft, the old drafting room. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Vivienne's voice was unmistakable. The way they all fell for it. Arthur was so blinded by his legacy that he never even checked the routing numbers on the consolidation accounts. He thinks he's moving the money to a Kensington trust. He's actually moving it to us. "And Julian?" Silas's voice was smooth, cultured. "He's the best part. He's going to spend the next 10 years fighting his father in court while we're on a beach in Montenegro. He actually believed he was the one who orchestrated the coup. Poor kid. He really is his mother's son, all heart and no head." I moved closer, stepping over rusted machinery, my hand gripping the heavy steel letter opener. "The drive is almost finished uploading," Silas continued. "Once the transfer hits the Cayman account, we trigger the suicide note from Alistair's private email, the one where he confesses to killing Jax and Vivienne in a fit of rage and embezzling the funds to cover his tracks." "What about Jax?" Vivienne asked. There was a brief pause. "He was my brother, Silas." "Jax was a liability," Silas said coldly. "He almost botched the lighthouse. He was never part of the long-term plan. Consider his death a business expense." I reached the top of the stairs. They were standing over a high-tech laptop rig, the screen glowing with a series of rapidly moving progress bars. Silas looked up, sensing the shift in the air. He didn't look surprised. He just looked disappointed. "Alistair," he said, straightening his coat, "you always were a bit too stubborn for your own good. You were supposed to be in Oregon, wallowing in your sawdust." "I decided I preferred the city," I said, stepping into the light, "especially when there's a pest problem that needs solving." Vivienne looked at me, a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. "You're a hard man to kill, Alistair. I'll give you that." "I'm not the one who's dying tonight," I said. I held up my phone. "I've been recording since I walked through that door. The satellite uplink is live. Every word you just said about the Caymans, the suicide note, and Jax, it's already on its way to the FBI." Silas's face didn't break. He just smiled. A recording? In a state with two-party consent laws? That's adorable, Alistair. But it won't hold up in court. And besides, who says you're leaving here to deliver it? He pulled a silenced pistol from his waistband, the movement so fluid it was clear he'd done this many times before. Goodbye, Alistair. Give my regards to Catherine. But before he could pull the trigger, a sound erupted from the shadows behind him. It wasn't the police. It was the sound of a heavy, wooden beam swinging on a rusted chain. It slammed into Silas, throwing him across the room like a rag doll. The gun skittered across the floor, falling into a gap between the floorboards. Julian stepped out of the darkness. He didn't look like the king of interiors now. He looked like a man who had finally seen the grain for what it was. He was covered in cobwebs and grease, his hands shaking, but his eyes were fixed on Silas. "I might be all heart, Silas," Julian said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying calm. "But my father taught me one thing: never trust a finish that looks too perfect." Julian looked at me, and for the first time in months, there was no hate in his eyes. There was only a profound, echoing sorrow. "I followed you, Dad. I saw the video you sent to the tablet. I got here 20 minutes ago." Vivienne lunged for the laptop, trying to shut down the transfer, but I was faster. I tackled her, the two of us crashing into the drafting table. I didn't use the letter opener. I didn't need to. I just held her down, pinning her against the wood she had tried so hard to steal. "It's over, Elena," I whispered. Downstairs, the real sirens finally began to wail. This time, they weren't a mockery. They were a reckoning. But as the police swarmed the building, I looked at Julian, who was standing over the unconscious Silas. "The company is gone, Julian," I said. "The consolidation, the poison pill, the reputation. There's nothing left but the name." Julian looked around the rotted, skeletal remains of the Kensington mill. He looked at the dust motes dancing in the blue police lights. "The name is a lie anyway," he said. He walked over to me and offered a hand. "Let's build something new, under a name that doesn't have a ghost attached to it." I took his hand. I felt the calluses on his palms, the ones I'd helped him earn. We walked out of the mill together, leaving Arthur, Silas, and Vivian to the mercy of a justice system they thought they'd outsmarted. The rain was finally stopping, the first hint of a real dawn breaking over the San Francisco skyline. I thought that was the end. I thought we had finally found the closure we'd been searching for since my wife died. But as we reached the bottom of the hill, a black car pulled up. The window rolled down, and a woman I hadn't seen in 30 years, a woman whose funeral I had attended, looked out at us. "You both did very well," she said, her voice a ghost of the woman I'd loved. "But we're not finished yet. Arthur was only the first chapter." It was Sarah, my wife, and she wasn't alone in the car. Sitting next to her was the real Kensington air. The world didn't just tilt, it shattered. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic, mocking drizzle, but the cold that settled into my bones had nothing to do with the weather. It was the kind of cold that comes when you realize the person you've mourned for 10 years, the woman whose favorite lilies you've placed on a headstone every anniversary, is looking at you through a car window with the eyes of a stranger. Sarah. She looked older, the lines around her eyes etched by a decade of secrets, but she was unmistakably the woman I had married. Her hair was shorter, tucked behind her ears in a way she never used to wear it, and the soft, nurturing glow I remembered had been replaced by a sharp, clinical detachment. Julian let out a choked, wounded noise that was half sob, half gasp. He reached for the car door, his fingers trembling, but the lock clicked before he could touch the handle. "Don't, Julian," Sarah said, her voice sounding like a radio broadcast from a distant dying star. "The boy I left behind is gone. The man you've become, said. Well, Alistair always was a talented craftsman. He carved you into exactly what he needed. You're dead," Julian whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "I watched the casket go into the ground. I held the doctor's hand when he told us your heart stopped. How is this possible?" "Money can buy a lot of things, Julian," she replied, her gaze shifting to me. "A fake death, a new identity in Switzerland, and a front-row seat to the slow-motion collapse of the sterling name. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I couldn't breathe in the house Alistair built. Every piece of furniture, every floorboard, was steeped in the blood of the Kensingtons. I couldn't be the queen of interiors for a man who stole his crown from my own family." I stepped forward, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. "You knew, Sarah. You knew about Arthur. You knew I took the patents to save us. I knew you took them because you were greedy, Alistair, she spat, and the venom in her voice was more painful than Silas's bullet could ever have been. You didn't save us. You shackled us. And you didn't just take the patents, you took my brother's life. Arthur didn't start that fire in Seattle. You did. You just didn't realize he'd crawl out of it. The ground felt like it was liquid. The fire in Mutngin Chin Chum Chin Mui Sao. I had always told myself it was an accident, an old space heater, in a sawdust-filled shop. But as I looked into Sarah's eyes, a memory I'd buried under 30 years of success clawed its way to the surface. I remembered the smell of the kerosene I'd used to clean the lacquer brushes. I remembered leaving the shop that night, seeing the flicker in the window, and, not turning back. I hadn't said it, but I'd let it burn. I'd let it burn because it was the only way to get the insurance money and the patents without Arthur's interference. I didn't know he was inside, I whispered, the confession tasting like ash. It doesn't matter now, Sarah said. She reached over and touched the shoulder of the person sitting in the passenger seat. A young woman, perhaps 24, turned to look at us. She had Sarah's chin and Arthur's eyes. This is Maya, the daughter Arthur never knew he had, the real Kensington heir. She's the one who's been funding Cassidy Thorne. She's the one who let Silas out of that facility. She didn't want the money, Alistair. She wanted the truth. Maya looked at me, and there was no hate in her expression. There was only a profound, exhausted boredom. To her, I wasn't a titan or a villain. I was just a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead yet. The poison pill you triggered on the server, Alistair, Maya said, her voice cool and professional. It didn't delete the designs. It rerouted them to my server. The sterling patents are gone. The Kensington designs have been returned to their rightful owner. By tomorrow morning, every showroom you own will be a hollow shell. You have the name, and you have the debt. That's all. Sarah looked at Julian one last time. There was a flicker of the mother I remembered, a momentary softening of the mask. Come with us, Julian. Leave him. Leave the name. We have a life for you where you don't have to be a masterpiece. You can just be a man. Julian stood there, caught between the mother who had come back from the dead and the father who had lied to keep him. He looked at me, and I saw the choice in his eyes before he even made it. He looked at the calluses on his hands, the ones I'd taught him to take pride in. Then he looked at the black car. You left me, Julian said, his voice regaining its strength. You let me grieve for 10 years. You let me fight a war you started, just so you could watch from the sidelines. You're not my mother. My mother would have stayed and fought for me. You're just another ghost. He stepped back from the car, moving to my side. He didn't take my hand, but he stood close enough that our shadows merged on the wet pavement. Sarah's face hardened. The mask was back. Then you've chosen your cage, Julian. Enjoy the ruins. The window rolled up, the black car pulled away, and within seconds, it was swallowed by the San Francisco fog. They were gone. Sarah, Maya, the patents, the legacy, all of it had vanished into the mist, leaving us standing in front of a rotted mill on the edge of a city that would wake up tomorrow and forget we ever existed. We stood in silence for a long time. The sirens had faded. The police had taken Silas and Vivienne away in a different direction, and the only sound was the drip of water from the rusted gutters of the mill. Is it true? Julian asked, not looking at me. About the fire? I didn't light the match, I said, but I didn't put it out. Julian nodded slowly. Then we're even. I didn't save you tonight because I love you, Dad. I saved you because I'm not a murderer, and because I needed to hear you say it. What now? I asked. I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. The Sterling Empire was a smoking crater. The bank accounts were empty. The showrooms were ghosts. Julian looked at his hands again. Now, we go back to the workshop, not the estate, not the flagship store, the small shop in the Mission, the one you kept off the books. There's nothing there but old tools and a few slabs of walnut, I said. Then that's where we start, Julian replied. He turned and began to walk down the hill, his stride purposeful. We're going to build one chair, Alistair, a good one. Without a patent, without a brand name, and without a lie. If it stands, we'll build another. And this time, we won't name the company after ourselves. We'll name it after the wood. I followed him. My legs were heavy, and my heart felt like it had been hollowed out with a lathe. But as I walked, I realized that for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of a secret. The Sterling legacy was dead. and in its place was something much harder, much uglier, but infinitely more real. The sun finally broke through the clouds as we reached the bottom of the hill. It wasn't a cinematic sunrise, it was a pale, watery light that revealed the grit and the trash in the gutters. It was an honest light. We didn't talk on the way to the mission. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't the cold silence of the lighthouse or the penthouse. It was the silence of two men who had lost everything but the ability to work. When we reached the small, dusty shop, Julian pulled out the key I'd given him years ago. He opened the door, and the scent of cedar and sawdust greeted us like an old friend. He walked over to the workbench and picked up a hand plane. He ran his thumb over the blade, checking the sharpness. "The grain is tricky on this walnut," he said, gesturing to a slab in the corner. "You have to go against the current if you want the finish to hold." I took off my ruined tuxedo jacket and rolled up my sleeves. I picked up a chisel and felt the familiar weight of the steel. It was the only thing that hadn't lied to me. "Then let's get to work," I said. We didn't build an empire that day. We didn't even finish the chair. But as the shavings fell to the floor, covering the old grease and the hidden secrets, I realized that revenge isn't always about destroying your enemies. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is surviving the person you were forced to become. Arthur Kensington had his patents, Sarah had her secrets, Silas and Vivian had their greed, but Julian and I, we had the wood, and in the end, that was the only legacy that was ever worth the cost. We worked until our hands bled and the sun dipped below the horizon, two men in a small shop, rebuilding a life one joint at a time. The world outside was still loud, still messy, and still full of predators, but inside the shop, the only thing that mattered was the truth of the craft. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.